My dad sent a message. "We've deleted your number and changed the locks. You're no longer part of this family." I responded, "Understood. But you forgot one crucial thing." Then I canceled the $4,700 monthly payment covering their house, the one I'd been quietly making for 19 months. 2 days later, their lawyer left a voicemail. "We need to talk immediately." I never contacted back, because by then, the bank had already seized it. I, 32M, stared at the text message on my phone, reading it for the 5th time in 10 minutes. The words hadn't changed, but somehow I kept hoping they would rearrange themselves into something less devastating. My father had typed those words with the same cold precision he'd used to balance his checkbook for 30 years. No emotion, no hesitation, just brutal efficiency. The message had arrived at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday while I was reviewing quarterly reports at my consulting firm. 19 months of secretly paying their mortgage, and this was how it ended. Not with gratitude or acknowledgement, but with digital excommunication. My hands trembled slightly as I set the phone down on my mahogany desk. The corner office overlooked downtown, and normally the view calmed me. Today, it felt like I was looking down at a world that had suddenly become foreign. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt right. The story began 2 years ago when my younger brother overdosed in their basement. I was 3 states away, building my career, when the call came. My mother's voice was barely recognizable through the tears. She told me he'd been struggling with addiction for months, that they'd tried everything. The funeral was small, family only, and afterward we all pretended we'd handle the grief together. But grief does strange things to families. Instead of pulling us closer, it created fault lines that grew wider each day. My parents blamed themselves. They blamed each other. And eventually, they blamed me for not being there when it mattered. The arguments started small. Why hadn't I visited more? Why hadn't I seen the signs during our video calls? Why had I encouraged him to stay at home instead of getting professional help? Each conversation became a minefield, and I found myself walking on eggshells whenever I called. 6 months after the funeral, my father lost his job. The company he'd worked for 23 years downsized, and at 58, he discovered that decades of loyalty meant nothing in a recession. My mother's part-time work at the library barely covered groceries, let alone the mortgage on the house they'd refinanced twice to pay for my brother's previous rehab attempts. They never asked for help directly. Pride runs deep in our family, sometimes deeper than common sense. But I could hear the strain in my mother's voice when she mentioned putting the house on the market. I could sense my father's humiliation when he talked about applying for jobs that paid half his previous salary. So I called their mortgage company and quietly took over the payments. Not officially. The loan remained in their names, but I set up automatic transfers that covered the monthly $4,700 payment. It wasn't pocket change, but my consulting business was thriving, and keeping my childhood home in the family felt like honoring my brother's memory. I never told them. They thought my father's unemployment benefits and my mother's small salary were somehow stretching to cover everything. They never questioned why the bank stopped calling, why the foreclosure notices stopped arriving. They just accepted their good fortune and moved forward. For 19 months, I watched $4,700 disappear from my account every month. Some months it hurt more than others, especially when my own business faced challenges. But every time I considered stopping, I'd remember coming home for Christmas as a kid, or the way my mother had looked when she talked about losing the house. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I was secretly keeping them afloat, our relationship was drowning. Every conversation became more strained. They'd make passive-aggressive comments about my absence during my brother's worst moments. They'd compare me to friends' children who lived closer, who called more often, who seemed to care more about family. I tried explaining that grief affects everyone differently, that I was dealing with my own guilt and pain. But somehow, my emotional distance became evidence of my selfishness. My success became proof that I'd abandoned my roots. My attempts to give them space to heal were interpreted as indifference. The final blow came 3 weeks before that devastating text message. I'd flown home for what I thought would be a reconciliation. My parents had invited me for dinner, and I'd hoped we could finally address the elephant in the room. Instead, it became an ambush. My father sat at the kitchen table where I'd done homework as a child and systematically listed every way I'd failed as a son and brother. My mother nodded along, occasionally adding her own grievances. I wasn't present enough. I didn't understand family responsibility. I'd chosen my career over my brother's life. The accusations weren't entirely unfair, and that made them hurt worse. I had prioritized my business. I had kept my distance. I had convinced myself that financial support from afar was better than emotional support up close. But sitting there, listening to my parents dissect my character, I realized we'd all become strangers wearing familiar faces. I left that dinner knowing something had fundamentally broken. The drive to the airport felt like leaving home for the last time, though I didn't understand why then. I just knew that the people who'd raised me had become people I barely recognized. 3 weeks later, the text arrived. We deleted my number. Changed the locks. No longer part of this family. The words hit like physical blows, each one precisely aimed to cause maximum damage. But as I sat in my office, staring at those words, something unexpected happened. The hurt began transforming into something colder, more calculating. They wanted to erase me from their lives. They wanted to pretend I'd never existed. Fine. But they'd forgotten one crucial detail. I opened my laptop and navigated to my bank's website. The automatic payment to their mortgage company was scheduled to process in 6 days. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my finger hovering over the cancel button. 19 months of payments. Nearly $90,000 of my money, given freely and without expectation of gratitude or recognition. I clicked cancel. Then I typed my response to my father's text. I told them I understood their decision and respected their wishes. I mentioned that while they'd thought of everything, they'd forgotten one crucial thing. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. Soon enough, they'd figure it out. The next few days passed in a strange haze. I went to work, attended meetings, reviewed contracts. But part of my mind remained focused on what was happening 3 states away. I imagined the mortgage company's automated system processing the return payment. I pictured the notification that would arrive in my parents' mailbox. 2 days after my response, my phone rang. Unknown number, but I recognized the area code. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from an attorney, speaking in the clipped, urgent tone lawyers use when someone's world is about to collapse. He needed to speak with me immediately regarding my parents' mortgage situation. There had been a misunderstanding, he said. Time-sensitive matters that required my immediate attention. I saved the voicemail and never returned the call. Update 1. The foreclosure process moves faster than most people realize, especially when there's already been missed payments. My parents had been living month to month for over a year before I started making their payments, skating by on extensions and payment plans. Once those payments stopped, the bank had no patience for additional delays. I learned this from my cousin, who called me a week after the lawyer's voicemail. She'd heard from her mother that my parents were in crisis mode. Apparently, they'd received a notice of default and had 30 days to bring their account current. The amount due was staggering, not just the missed payment, but accumulated fees, legal costs, and penalties that had been waived while the payments were current. My cousin asked if I knew anything about their situation. She mentioned that my parents seemed confused about how they'd managed to stay current for so long. They couldn't understand how their modest income had covered the mortgage when it obviously fell short by thousands each month. I told her I was no longer in contact with my parents. She seemed surprised, but didn't press for details. Family drama was nothing new in our extended family, though this particular rift was deeper than most. 2 weeks later, she called again. The house was going to auction. My parents had tried everything: loan modification, refinancing, even attempting to sell quickly. But their credit had been damaged by the previous missed payments, and the current market made a quick sale impossible. They were going to lose everything. My cousin asked if I'd consider helping them, maybe co-signing for a new loan or providing a down payment for a smaller place. She had no idea I'd been the invisible force keeping them housed for over a year. To her, and to everyone else, I was just the distant son who'd prioritized his career over family. I told her I was sorry to hear about their situation, but couldn't get involved. She was quiet for a long moment before asking if I'd at least talk to them. They were desperate, she said. Maybe this crisis could bring us back together. I almost laughed. Bring us back together? They'd deleted my number and changed their locks. They'd declared me dead to them. But now that they needed something, suddenly family meant something again. Update 2. The auction was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 10 a.m. I know this because I'd been monitoring the legal notices online, the same way I'd monitored their mortgage payments for 19 months. I wasn't planning to attend, but I found myself booking a flight Tuesday night. I told myself I just wanted to see the house one more time before it was gone. The truth was more complicated. Part of me needed to witness the consequences of their decision. Part of me wondered if I'd feel regret or vindication. Mostly, I needed to know if the people who'd raised me would recognize what they'd lost. I arrived Wednesday evening and checked into a hotel downtown. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was staying in a hotel in my hometown because my own parents had changed the locks. I drove past the house that night, a route I'd taken thousands of times as a teenager. It looked smaller than I remembered, shabbier. The yard needed work, and one of the shutters hung crooked. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold. I parked across the street from the courthouse and watched people gather for the auction. Real estate investors with clipboards, young couples hoping for a bargain, and a few desperate homeowners trying to save their properties. My parents arrived 20 minutes before the auction started. They looked older than I remembered, worn down in a way that went beyond normal aging. My father's shoulders sagged in his too big suit, the one he'd probably worn to job interviews for the past 2 years. My mother clutched his arm like she was afraid of falling. They stood apart from the crowd, whispering to each other with the urgency of people who know they're about to watch their world end. I wondered if they'd figured out the connection yet. Did they understand that their son's exile and their financial catastrophe were related? Or did they still believe these were separate tragedies? The auction itself was anticlimactic. The auctioneer read the legal description while my parents stood frozen. A few investors made half-hearted bids, but the opening bid was too high for most bargain hunters. Finally, a property management company won with a bid barely above the outstanding loan balance. 19 months of my payments, and the house sold for almost exactly what was owed. If I'd continued making payments for just 3 more months, they would have owned it free and clear. The timing would have been poetic if it weren't so devastating. My parents didn't stay for the paperwork. I watched them walk to their old sedan, my mother crying silently while my father stared straight ahead. They sat in the car for several minutes before driving away. I wondered where they were going. My cousin had mentioned they'd found a small apartment across town, but seeing them leave felt like watching the final page of a story I'd helped write. Update 3. I flew home that afternoon, expecting to feel some sense of closure. Instead, I felt hollow. I'd proven my point, demonstrated my importance in their lives, shown them the consequences of their actions. But victory felt surprisingly empty. For weeks, I waited for some form of contact. Not an apology exactly, but some acknowledgement of what had happened. Maybe they'd pieced together the timeline and realized their son had been their anonymous benefactor. Maybe they'd understand that their financial security and family security had been connected all along. The silence stretched into months. My cousin stopped calling, probably tired of playing messenger for a family that seemed determined to stay broken. I threw myself into work, expanding my consulting business and taking on increasingly complex projects. Success became my insulation against the growing emptiness. 6 months after the auction, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photo album I recognized from my childhood. The first page had a note in my mother's handwriting. She wrote that she'd found some of my things while packing for their move. She thought I might want the memories, even if I no longer wanted the family. I flipped through pages of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations. There I was at 8 years old, grinning gap-toothed while my father taught me to ride a bike. My brother and I building sandcastles at the beach. All of us together, before grief and pride and stubbornness tore everything apart. The last photo was from my college graduation. My parents flanking me in my cap and gown, all of us beaming with pride and possibility. My brother had taken the picture, barely 16 and still years away from the addiction that would eventually destroy him and fracture our family. On the back of that photo, my mother had written a message. She said she finally understood about the mortgage payments. A friend at the bank had mentioned seeing my name in their system. She wrote that she didn't know how to feel about what I'd done, the helping or the stopping. She wasn't sure forgiveness was possible on either side, but she wanted me to know that she remembered when we were happy. I closed the album and set it on my bookshelf next to my college textbooks and business awards. For the first time since this all began, I cried. Not for the house or the money or the family drama, but for the realization that winning and being right weren't the same thing as being happy. The mortgage payments had stopped, the house was gone, and my parents were strangers. I'd successfully demonstrated my power and importance. I'd proven that actions have consequences and that love without respect is meaningless. But sitting alone in my corner office, surrounded by the symbols of my success, I realized I'd also lost something irreplaceable. The family that had raised me was gone, not just because of their cruelty or my pride, but because of the collective choices we'd all made when grief turned us into people we didn't recognize. The bank had seized their house, just like I'd planned. But in the process, I'd lost the only home that really mattered. And unlike a mortgage, some things can't be paid off or bought back. Some losses are permanent, no matter how much money you have or how right you were. The photo album sits on my shelf now, a reminder of what we used to be and what we chose to become. Sometimes I think about calling them, about trying to build something new from the ashes of what we destroyed. But then I remember that they deleted my number, changed their locks, and declared me dead to them. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Some families, once broken, stay broken. And sometimes, getting exactly what you wanted is the cruelest punishment of all.